All right. So thank you for the inaugural, for joining the inaugural session here of the Movement Professional Collaborative Mentorship, and I hope it is as collaborative as possible. But first, I just want to talk about like who I am and why it might be useful to listen to me at all, if it is, and what I hope to bring to the table. Certainly, I want this to be as collaborative as possible, but I will take the lead as early as I can to provide the content. So my name's Chris Lieb. I am the owner and founder of Movement Professional, and it's a company that I started in 2014, and it was a very small thing, and it still kind of is a small thing, but it's definitely grown from a business perspective of the amount of clients I have and the people I'm sharing space with, and just from a business perspective, going from working at a clinic to where I am now, I would say the gross revenue has grown about fourfold in that time. So there has been definitely improvement just from quality of life standpoint going into my clinical job as a therapist to owning the business that I own now. So hopefully that'll be useful to talk about some things that we can kind of build from a business standpoint when we're looking at being movement professionals and how we can grow. My education is I'm a doctor of physical therapy from the University of Scranton. I graduated in 2006 with my master's, went back and got my doctorate in 2012. And then just listing my certifications, the only purpose of listing this would just be to say like these things will be touched upon at some point through this mentorship process. And I have probably taken too many courses over the years because I do not keep up with many of them, but I have found a lot of common threads in many of the courses that I've taken, and that's going to be foundational in what we talk about over the coming months to hopefully years, as long as we decide to be able to be in this process together. So I've gone through the McKenzie certification, Maitland Australian physiotherapy seminars, where I was actually trained by one of the founding faculty members there. So I learned a lot about that process for a short amount of time. You can see some of these certifications are no longer current, but I have gone through the process. I was in the functional range release world, which is the functional anatomy systems (FRC), the SFMA world, neurokinetic therapy, Bill Hartman's intensive, which if you're not familiar with Bill, that'll be a big part of what we talk about when we get into some biomechanics and understanding the body and understanding expansion and compression. Postural Restoration Institute, or PRI, that's something that definitely has been very useful in my more recent thought process of the body and movement. Taken several courses there. I'll likely have Dr. Frank Mallon on at some point to talk about his experience there. He is I think he was the first certified PRC through the Postural Restoration Institute in Pennsylvania. Very knowledgeable there, does some really cool things with vision, dentation, and how that ties into mechanics and the airway and things like that. So my hope is to get him on, and he'll speak more intelligently than I will about it. But there's definitely a lot of influences in my system through Postural Restoration Institute. And a guy, I don't know if any of you have heard of him, Philip Beach. He wrote a book called Muscles and Meridians. I took some courses with him, or one course with him, which I thought was really, really useful on the contractile field model, archetypal postures, decoding the meridial map. So there'll be definitely some influences from him. And that's more from the strength or from the physical therapy world and strength and conditioning. I was a certified strength and conditioning specialist. I let that lapse. Things got too many things on my plate. But at this point, I was using a lot of stuff from NSCA, but haven't necessarily found it super useful. But certainly was one of the first things I did when I came out of school is I made sure that I felt comfortable training other individuals as a strength and conditioning specialist, as well as being a physical therapist. So as long as I've been a therapist, I've been a strength and conditioning professional. So I do have going on 19 years now of experience in both worlds, working in both worlds. Certainly more initially in the physical therapy space, but I would say of late, I'm more in the strength and conditioning space, just the way that the business is sort of fallen and what the clients are really looking for. A big focus within strength and conditioning for me is through the Strong First world, where I'm an elite instructor. I also have a lot of influences from CrossFit. Bioforce, I don't know if anyone's heard of Joel Jamieson. And Joel Jamieson is someone who I love his work when it comes to conditioning and cardiovascular health. He's got a product called the Morpheus. Originally, it was called Bioforce. Now it's called Morpheus, and it's one of my favorite tools for getting clients to work with cardiovascular conditioning. So we will eventually go into systems for assessing cardiovascular health as well as looking at conditioning, and a lot of the influences will come from his line of work. So have some golf running specialties, but the idea is that all of this history that I have will go into what I talk about. But again, I'm hoping to get some input from others as well of what your specialties are. So just wanted to start with that. This will be the last time I talk about myself, but I wanted to kind of have this in here to know why would you want to listen to me and kind of spend your Sundays. This is where I'll be coming from. So today, first thing we're going to discuss though is what I find to be absolutely foundational in most of the systems that we'll discuss when it comes to combining physical therapy, rehab with strength and conditioning, is this idea of being able to think on a continuum versus black and white thinking. So what is continuum-based thinking? First, we'll look to define a continuum. And there's a couple different ways we can look to do that, where the first one would be a continuous sequence in which adjacent elements are not perceptibly different, but the extremes are quite different. And I like that definition because that looks at broad categories that we'll talk about, like archetypes and things like that, which are often brought up in health. But we have to appreciate that in the grand scheme of reality, when we're working in a process, that the extremes might not be that different, or how we work on them have to be in these sort of minute manners to try to get them better or worse. So I like to think of it as like we're trying to work with people to attune their volume knobs up and down, as opposed to thinking of things like an on-off switch, which a lot of times clients will come in with that mentality. So the idea of continuum-based thinking would be to look at things, maybe understanding broad categories of contrast, but we also want to understand that we're trying to really look at things as a game of inches, not as trying to make a dichotomy of one thing is good and one thing is bad. And that's going to be, what this whole conversation is really about, and how that looks, how we look at that throughout health. So continuum-based thinking sees concepts as existing on a spectrum, not absolutes. It emphasizes gradations, nuance, and context. So two, methodologies that come to mind, which are in psychology and physiology, are graded exposure, progressive adaptation, which again will be foundational in how we look at system for progression. And continuum-based thinking recognizes growth, progress, and adaptation over time. Where black and white thinking views situations as either or, good or bad, success, failure. It ignores complexity, and it can often lead to rigid, judgmental, and perfectionist attitudes. So why might we default to this type of black and white thinking? Well, one, simplicity. It's often easier to process. Certainty, which we'll talk about in the next slide, which reduces anxiety temporarily. And then tribalism, which encourages an us versus them mindset, which we'll talk about some of the evolutionary reasons for that. So looking at dopamine, certainty, and black and white thinking, there is one of the key insights is that black and white thinking, or dichotomous thinking, will offer certainty. So that could be neurologically rewarding, even if the thinking is inaccurate. So there's been research that shows that dopamine reinforces perceived correctness and predictability. It's also involved in reward anticipation and evaluating predictability. So basically, feeling certain engages dopamine circuits and creates a rewarding sensation. And then this certainly can reinforce rigid beliefs, even if they're oversimplified or incorrect. And then basically what that can lead to, some implications for mindset and behavior, would be that there's neural patterns that certainly reinforce this type of thinking. And black and white thinking basically becomes neurologically addicting. All right, so growth and continuum mindsets are less immediately rewarding, but they certainly will be what we're looking for to promote adaptive learning and resilience over time. But they can be very hard to break, and it certainly requires conscious and repeated effort. And that's what is going to be our role as coaches in many ways, is to try to see where our clients are, meet them where they are, but also be able to gradually get them into more of a continuum-based mindset and they're thinking about their health, and be able to see basically where they can make change. And to me, because I have more time with people of late, over the last decade now, in the more of a one-on-one environment, I get to have the time and the patience to see people's mentalities change. And very early on, a lot of people that come in with chronic ailments, and you all see this, they come in with a very fixed mindset, and oftentimes they're looking for a very specific diagnosis and a very specific fix, and they don't really have an understanding of what we do as therapists or movement professionals, or what we're going to try to do with them. And oftentimes that's bring them through a process, an ongoing process. And I think part of the problem of the healthcare model, that especially in physical therapy, where we have to look at things in episodes because we have to discharge people based on what their insurance will cover, we often don't have enough time to work with people, and we start to actually think in more black and whites because we have to have an ICD-10 code, and we have to be very specific with our time frame and how we document to insurance companies. So it starts to actually make us as movement professionals think more in black and white. And then I think that carries over into the formal education process and even into research. So being able to have more time with people and actually be able to work with people over years and decades, you really can see a change in these mindsets, but we have to be patient there. And I don't necessarily think we need years and years. I just think if we start from that idea of that's our goal, is to try to educate people gradually, whether it's in continued sessions coming in, or just try to give them some references that they can start thinking about things a little bit different, then I think that's going to be a part of like how we want to approach working with clients.